This is Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel. When I think about the critical issues facing Black and Brown residents in the St. Louis area, I often ask the questions: how did we get here? What's holding us back? And how do we progress? At 9 PBS, we want to deepen our understanding and change the narrative. Join me as I look for answers and discover solutions on today's podcast. February marks Black History Month in the United States, a celebration created by historian Dr. Carter G. Woodson and launched as Negro History Week in February of 1926. That was 5 years after the massacre of hundreds of African Americans on what was known as Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And 1 year after 30,000 Klansmen marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. Today, the teaching of Black history is being met with some resistance as to how it is taught and if it should be taught at all. Today on Listen St. Louis, rather than discuss notable African Americans or achievements, I'll be joined by two historians to discuss how and why we remember history at all. We are joined by Reverend Dr. Priscilla Dowden-White, Associate Professor of History and Director of the African and African American Diaspora Studies Certificate at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. She is also an itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where she serves as pastor of Bethel AME in Paynesville, Missouri. Our second guest, Dr. Jerome E. Morris, the E. Desmond Lee Endowed Professor of Urban Education at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. He serves as the principal investigator and director of the Center for Communally Bonded Research. Now, part one of our Black History Month discussion.
Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel is supported in part by Midwest Bank Center, the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation, and Orvin and Latrice Kimbrough.
Welcome back to another episode of Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel, and I thank you so much for listening. And thank you for subscribing. Please just hit that subscribe button. It's very easy to do, and you become a subscriber. Many of you are sharing this podcast, and you're also downloading it to watch and listen to later. All those things are fine, but just make sure that you are engaging in this conversation. We have a goal here at Listen St. Louis, and that is to change the narrative, the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And that is not more important than the conversation we are going to have today. And that comes Black History Month 2024. This is a moment in time when the teaching of Black history, it's safe to say, is being scrutinized. It is all but under attack. Will the lesson make students feel bad about themselves? Some fear. Will the lesson make America or Americans look bad or feel bad? I have two incredible guests. We're so fortunate in the St. Louis area to have wonderful universities, and these two come from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And you just heard all their titles, so I won't rehash those, but I want to say welcome to Dr. Professor Jerome Morris. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Carol.
And to Dr. Professor Priscilla Dowden-White. It's so good to see you again.
Thank you so much, Carol.
We are ready for this conversation. We've been talking for a good half an hour already.
Yes.
Last year, I should say since last year, Education Week did an analysis and found that 14 states have imposed restrictions on teaching Black history through legislation, executive actions, or commission votes. We know here locally that the Francis Howell School Board removed and then reinstated an elective course on Black history. And I want to read for you what the vice president of the board said, Randy Cook Jr., that the Francis Howell courses he objected to used social justice standards developed by the Southern Poverty Law Center with a bent, he felt, toward activism. He said, and I quote, "I do not object to teaching Black history and Black literature, but I do object to teaching Black history and Black literature through a social justice framework. Cook said in an email that I do not believe it is the public school's responsibility to teach social justice and activism. So I kind of want to start there with both of you. Given that Black history in America unfolded based on the fight to be free,
Yes.
the fight to learn, the fight to be treated fairly and equally and to not be killed just for being Black. Isn't that social justice? And so when we look at Black history, one of the prisms is social justice, is it not?
That's correct. It's social justice in the sense that when you think about the history of the United States, and I know Dr. Priscilla Dowden-White is going to probably talk a little bit more about that, is that in 1776, the founders were really fighting for the spirit of freedom. It was rooted in the origin of this country. And African people fought. African people were critical in that 20%. There's a book called The Forgotten Fifth. 20% of the people who fought for this country were African people. And so that becomes important because during that spirit in which there was this fight against the British, the colonists were saying, we believe in self-determination. We believe that people should be free, humans should be free. And that initially they wanted to extend that to the Africans if they fought with them, but they reneged on that promise. And that's really why we're here. And as I talked about earlier, that people are treating this as though this is something that is in the past. We know that the past is always ever present. And one of the things is that we have to do is that we have to remember that and understand that the social justice piece is central because what was happening was an injustice that the colonists felt. And so did not the colonists embrace a social justice framework? I would say to the school board president and the vice president, they definitely did.
Clearly
and
did.
that's what they did. That's why they created the Constitution. That's why they created the Bill of Rights. That's why they approached it the way they did to ensure that justice would prevail. And so justice has always been part of what the founders wanted, is that some people today want to go against what the founders were initially talking about, which is puzzling and disappointing.
And, I don't know what else I might add to that right now, except to say that there's a conflation that takes place in our dialogue regarding social justice, critical race theory, what else? I mean,
Diversity,
equity,
1619 project, throwing it all together.
Yes. And I think we have to kind of unpack some of that too in our discussion today, because part of what's going on in the pushback against African American history is a pushback because we don't really want to deal with what fundamentally is the problem in our society. And in order to deal with that, and the first thing we need to say is that, we are, in a sense, living a lie. We're
Taking notes.
We're living a lie when we do not wish to study what I and others might refer to as the promise of America. I mean, when we talk about African American history, we're not just talking about the history of one group. Really, we can't just talk about the history of one group.
We're part of the fabric.
We're
intertwined with the
intertwined.
founding.
Yes. And when we go back to what Brother Jerome just talked about in the very foundation of our society, when we go back to 1776, when we go back to the Declaration of Independence, when we go back to the Bill of Rights, when we go back to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, all of that, while all of that is taking place, this is a slave-holding society. Yet it is a society that is grappling with the meaning of freedom and grappling with the meaning of this experiment in democracy in the making. And all of that is taking place simultaneously. So, again, the first thing we have to deal with is the truth, the reality of where we began. That's not a pretty story
at all.
However, it's a story that is not just about oppression, oppressive forces. It's also a story about the struggle for freedom.
That's right.
Freedom of the colonists from British rule, but also freedom from some of the citizens of this nation who were not yet viewed as citizens.
People, not yet viewed as people.
Not yet viewed as people, but except the problem with that is that those who were not viewing them as people knew that they were people.
A part of that lie you
they
spoke
could
of.
not know that they were people. And so in the process of trying to oppress, trying to control, trying to make them into something other than people, trying to make them into property, they have to try to take their humanity. And that's not something that is easily done.
And we have struggled ever since.
We have struggled ever since. But it's that struggle that we cannot divorce from any part of America's history that makes us who we are, that makes us who we are as a nation and as a people, as a collective people.
And I do want to ask this, what may seem like a basic question of two who are authors and doctors, and that is, who have we become as a people not knowing our history?
So I want to just say, when you say we, so I'm thinking the collective, the United States is one, and then black people is another.
For sure.
So for me, one of the things is that I think about Dr. John Henry Clark. He was one of the first people to help us have an African-centered way of thinking in terms of teaching of history. And he talked about how history is like a clock that people use to gauge or tell where they are politically and culturally. So you think about history as a clock and where they are in time. So one of the things is that in terms of black people, when I think about the we in that sense, I think about that the imperativeness of black people knowing who we are. We just had a conversation earlier that when one gets to a point, can one look back and reflect on where they've come and what has brought them out of the conditions. So it's very crucial that as black people, people of African descent who were enslaved, that part of our understanding is crucial for us to have that grounding, to understand who we are, where we've come from, and how. See, one of the things is that another thing that Dr. John Henry Clark talks about is that when you use, for example, slavery, and we talked about the founding of the United States, but African people, our ancestors, predated this whole experiment called the United States. So if you begin the people's history with the slavery, then you've already set them back. You know, they're already behind when you begin in slavery. Everything else looks like progress. So we'll sit here and say, oh, we're here, look what we've done. No, look what we used to do. And so that's why. So that's the part about in terms of why it's so important for black people. The other part in terms of the United States is that what does it mean in terms of understanding history, and Dr. Priscilla Dowden-White talked about, is that it's crucial to grapple with the problems, to grapple with, you know, to be uncomfortable.
The
White
ugliness,
folks, they just aren't.
Right.
People have to be uncomfortable, get uncomfortable, because we've been uncomfortable for 300 years. It's very important. And I always think about the great philosophers, Franklin, Beverly, and Mays. They said,
Sunshine and rain.
Ain't no sunshine. Yeah. Joy and pain are like sunshine and rain. Frederick Douglass said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. There has to be struggle. So struggle is crucial to growth. And we know that. You know, you can't give somebody or something just everything without incurring struggle, because the struggle is what strengthens you. And so in terms of the United States, in terms of understanding itself, you have to go through that. But so I have two messages. I have one for us, and there's one for this country as a whole. But I want us to know that we were here before this country. It's very important. And the country was built, we are what I call the startup capital to American enterprise. We're that startup capital. It's like when people, like Shark Tank now, you invest, there were a lot of people investing in black bodies in order to generate capital. Once they generated their capital, they diversified and went to other areas, and you never knew that they once were part of a slave legacy. So that's what we're dealing with. So we need to know who we are as we move forward.
And I would just add, you know, you say you have two messages.
Yes.
And I think I'm going to, and I think I understand what you mean
Yeah.
by that. The message, you have one message to African Americans.
It's
and
about
then you
love
have-
and
yeah.
Right.
ourselves,
And
who we are.
And then there's another message to the nation,
Yes.
to the country. And I think for me, those two messages are so intertwined. They're not. I don't know that they're two messages for me. Although there are times when I emphasize certain things more so than others, depending on who I'm talking to. But as a teacher, as a professor, as an Americanist, as an African Americanist historian, no matter what class I'm teaching that has to do with American history, African American history is
there.
central. Now, it's not just there, it's actually central. See, we can teach about the history of this nation by centering African American history.
Which would blow up Randy Cook Jr.'s mind, I think.
Yeah, because part of what I'm thinking about here is, and I have to be very careful here because it could easily sound like I'm suggesting that we don't need to teach African American history. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we need to teach African American history every day, throughout the year. It needs to be central in our curriculum. It should not be on the margin of our curriculum.
Why?
And
Why?
I
Why?
understand.
Why? Why do you say that?
I say that because, and I think Dr. Jerome has really laid this out so well for us. I say that because African Americans are so central to the founding of this nation. Who we are, not only socially as a nation, but economically,
Certainly culturally.
culturally, we're the foundation of the core of this nation. So you can teach American history by centralizing the African American experience and coming out from there and talking about the experiences of all Americans. Now, I get that you cannot teach all history, in a 16-week course or what have you.
Right.
You have
There are limits.
You have to make some choices. But it has to do with centralizing African Americans.
Well, I would say the one reason in which I see the two messages is that so often, no matter what metric we use, who was it that said that America catches a cold and black people get the flu? Or so I'm totally paraphrasing that and messing it up, I'm sure, as well. But it is as if in my heart we cannot afford to continue to not know who we are.
Yes.
Because the effects on African Americans, economically, culturally, spiritually, not knowing who we are, because we have fewer resources, which means fewer capital. We are on the margins of life, far too many of us. That's why for me there is although we are central and we are woven into the flag, we are in the soil, we are in the founding of it all, and yet we are suffering, and a part of the suffering, far too much suffering, perhaps is because we don't know who we are and we don't know our history. So for me, that's why there is a separate message, which is why this podcast exists as a separate message. It's a separate message about us and to us, and anybody else who wants to hear it, welcome. But I wanted to focus on us. How did we get here? And that's a question. How did we get here? And is this because of previous Republican administration? Is that how we got here today? That so many states are saying, was it the pandemic? Because things began during the pandemic, of course. Yes. Takeovers of school boards and anger about masks. Is that how we got here in 2024? That we are looking at not including books on Ruby Bridges and not including Black history as an elective course, even voting to not have such a thing. How did we get here?
So
or have we always been here?
Well, I think in some ways we've always been here, but where we are now, we have to go back at least 50 years. And even longer. But I'll say that we have to go back at least post 1960s to really understand this pushback, because it really is a pushback to, I would say, the United States living up to its ideals.
Right.
Are we in another moment of post-Reconstruction?
Yeah, that's where
feels
she's
that
going.
way.
Yeah,
that does happen. And so anytime when black people ascend this notion of ascending, and that's what you're getting at, then there's this pushback. We've seen it, like you mentioned, during Reconstruction. You had mentioned it around the 60s, right?
Yeah, and it's and when you say ascending, I think I'm hearing
this
you talk about black progress.
Yes,
and it's definitely that, but that's also connected to this investment in whiteness.
Now, I don't want to spend I try not to talk about or focus on who white people are, what they need to do, or how they need to live their lives as it pertains to me.
That's not where
you're going.
That's not where I'm going with this.
Okay.
I don't think we can even have this conversation authentically if we don't talk about the investment in whiteness, in white supremacy, because it is a pushback on Black progress, but that's connected to some people believing that Black Americans, that African Americans should be in a certain place,
Right.
should be locked into a certain status in the society.
So I'm remembering now. I think it was the CMAs, the Country Music Awards.
Yeah.
This might have been 2022, might even be 2023, and there were some Black performers and or presenters who weren't traditionally in country music, and the next day a country music performer, don't know his name, tweeted basically, "Can't we have anything to ourselves, y'all? Why are y'all here?"
Yeah.
And then the whole day was spent trying to explain the foundations of music in this country.
Yes. Right.
And how we are in all of it.
Yes.
And you have none of it without us. But that reminds me, that example brings to mind for me that this notion that we should remain in our place, whatever that is to some white people. And that is an example, of that.
Absolutely, and that has never gone away.
Right.
I mean, that's been ever present in American history, in some people's vision of what this country is supposed to be, what this country is really all about,
And who it belongs to.
and who it belongs to. You know, this notion that Black people are not patriotic
Is
that
offensive to me.
It should be offensive to all Americans, really. That Black people who really are more representative of American patriotism, I would argue, than most groups in this nation when we look historically. I mean, it's really a marvel when you think about the history, what has happened to African Americans historically in this country, that African Americans would love this country, that we would be invested,
That we would fight for it.
that we would fight for this country from day one, from the Revolutionary War. You
Fighting for a country that does not love you back.
Yes.
that does not love you back, and claiming your citizenship even before the Constitution recognizes you as a citizen,
Fully human.
as fully
As fully
human.
So one of the things, like building on that though, is that I just got my own certain references out. For some reason, I think about Malcolm X, what he talked about. He talked about this notion that Black people in America were the first in uniform form that died on every battlefield that existed. They were the first casualties of many of the wars. They've contributed more than any other group, but like you said, they've collected less. We've collected less.
We are still.
Yeah. So really, that's the essence of it. So in terms of so really, any conversation around Black history, any conversation around civil rights, any conversations around social justice, these conversations should have taken place in 1776. They should have taken place yesterday. We shouldn't have these conversations like, where do we go from here type thing. No, these conversations should have been resolved 200 plus years ago.
Based on
Right. The contributions, the commitment, the sacrifice, the dedication, the patriotism that African people demonstrated before any of the recent Europeans or any other group of immigrants eventually made it to these shores.
There's a new book out by Joy Reid on Medgar and Murray Evers, from a love story standpoint, which is a wonderful way to approach them. And that Medgar Evers, from Mississippi, leading the NAACP, was assassinated before Malcolm X and Dr. King, who's not listed on in many people's minds as one of the leading figures in the civil rights movement. But what I've read in that book, and what I did not know, is World War II veteran. And when he came back, as many were, he got on a bus, he sat in the front, He was in uniform. And the driver told him, now, when we get to Mississippi, you're going to have to move. And he said no. And the driver called others. And when he had got to Mississippi, they beat him almost to death. And was he not 21, 22, 23, about that age? And that was one of those things that set him on the path to try to wrest control of Mississippi from the hands of the Klan and of white supremacists and terrorists.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you hear Medgar Evers, but there's so much that we're still learning, and that's why this conversation is so
absolutely. And as you were talking about Medgar Evers and Pearlie Evers, I thought about Fannie Lou Hamer. You know, and she is someone whom I love to teach, because she was in her 40s before she voted in a U.S. election. And here is someone who was one of 20-something children who experienced forced sterilization as a young woman, and couldn't therefore have biological children of her own. Came from, a sharecropping background. And here she is, when she reaches 40, she has become politicized, at a point in life when many people are saying, okay, I'm just going to coast the rest of this out. But now she has understood her own personal experience as being part and parcel of a larger struggle.
That's right.
And that's what I mean when I say she had become, politicized. And when you mentioned Medgar Evers, and I thought about the fact that, Fannie Lou Hamer was beaten within inches of her life. And never recovered, physically, or I'm sure emotionally from that.
Listen St. Louis with Carol Daniel is supported in part by Midwest Bank Center, the Betsy and Thomas Patterson Foundation, and Orvin and Latrice Kimbrough.